Okay then, good afternoon. And it is my great honor to welcome you to the 2024 Edgar Mittelholzer Memorial Lecture.
Her talk about Melville's writing life in the Rupununi promises the rightful and much delayed restoration of a lost literary foremother. Ladies and gentlemen, may I present Professor Alison Donnell. Thank you very much.
Thank you to the Minister of Youth, Culture and Sport for inviting me to deliver this lecture, to Ms. Tamika Boatswain, Director of Culture, and Professor Al Crichton for assisting with all the arrangements. Thank you also to the Leverhulme Trust for that funding. It's a dream to have the twinkles and glimmers of your research imagination actually given time and resource, and that's what that project did for me. So it gave me time to look for the remarkable Edwina Melville. Thank you to Tondeley Simonett, Edwina's daughter, who's not only shared so many personal papers with me, but become a co-researcher, and her expertise in regional life and stories has really illuminated and enriched my own engagement with the material. Thank you to Evelyn, who has been a collaborator, a friend, true friend, as well as an academic inspiration, really for all my career. It really is such an honor and privilege to deliver this lecture, to tread in the footsteps of my undergraduate heroes like Wilson Harris and Dennis Williams and Pauline Melville and Arthur James Seymour. I was first introduced to Caribbean literature by Michael Gilkes, who was both a brilliant mind and a magnificent teacher. He was visiting professor at the University of Warwick, and then I continued my studies under David Aberdeen, who has supervised my doctoral project. So my arrival to Caribbean literature was kind of infused and inspired by Guyanese writers and writings. My own path was set determinately on women writers from the start. In fact, I'd gone to Warwick because of Germaine Greer. But what I found was this amazing wealth of expertise in Caribbean writing. So today offers me a really welcome opportunity to bring those two focuses together as I explore Edwina Melville and her writing life in Guyana. And I really want that phrase to tilt both ways, both thinking about what it was to be a writer in Guyana, and also how her life and her writing was devoted to bringing Guyana into the literary sphere. So for those of you who've not heard of Edwina Melville, she's a Guyanese writer, journalist and politician, born Edwina Gordon in 1926 in Mahaicony, educated in Georgetown at Bishop's High School, apprenticed to journalism at the Chronicle. She relocated to the Leverhulme region of the Rupununi in 1950, living there until she died in 1993. And despite significant flickers of international recognition in her lifetime, Edwina is all but missing from Guyanese and Anglophone Caribbean literary histories. So the lecture really for me is to make a case here today of why we need to restore her to those histories, why we need to read her writings in detail and in the context of those histories. And this is a Wikipedia entry that I wrote for her, which is actually how I found Tondeley, but that's another story that I'd be happy to tell afterwards. I really feel keenly that instead of just hearing my academic voice, I'd love you to hear Edwina's writing. So at a couple of points, I'm going to ask Tondeley to read from her work, because I'm making these claims for her and I want you all to be able to agree with me. She's a beautiful writer. I'm actually going to begin today, though, with Mittelholzer himself, and in particular his piece on a rather apt topic, literary criticism and the creative writer, that was published in Caversham in 1952. It feels like a good starting point because some of the issues that he places his finger on are those that I'm concerned with now. So first is Mittelholzer's insistence on the writer abandoning received ideas of the literary, on having something really authentic and honest to communicate, and a passion for writing. I won't read all of this, but he says, I'm addressing the writer who feels that the poem or short story or novel he is bringing to life is emphatically his own and not a pastiche of half-veiled cribbings from works of other writers, not a collection of cautious cliches or even sensational cliches intended to impress. I am speaking to the writer who loves his own ideas, who respects his own opinions, and is determined, even if the heavens cave in, to say what deep is in his heart or in his reason he feels to be the truth about people and things. And I hope you'll see by the end of the lecture that that's a very good description of Edwina as a writer. But what about his questioning of the value and purpose of the critic? So he says, and now for the question I want to pose. What, from a strictly down-to-earth practical point of view, is the use of criticism to any creative artist? I mean, that's quite an ouch to someone who's built their career on that, but without criticism, I'll readily admit, the artist would be like a man sealed up in a glass case, left severely to himself in the middle of a public park. So egotistic is the species, the writer, not men, although we could go there, that without the stimulus of criticism, be it favourable or adverse, the human spirit would wither. And yet, alongside this dismissal of the critic, Mittelholzer then goes on to actually point out how powerful critics are. He says, added to the critics who actually appear on stage, so to speak, there are the backstage critics, the publishers' readers, the literary advisors, the pundits in editorial offices, the editors of literary reviews, the men who give advice to the creative writers and whose business it is to sift through the not-so-good from the very good and accordingly decide whether the would-be writer makes his bow or remains in backstage obscurity. Now, those same questions of what constitutes a mid-century Caribbean writer and what backstage powers control their visibility and recognition are very pertinent to Edwina's writing life. And while Mittelholzer cheerily concludes that the writer just shouldn't care about critics, in fact he says, just ignore me, I don't want to see you, he doesn't address that question of what is the good of criticism, and I want to come back to that at the end today. It's worth noting, of course, that when Mittelholzer wrote this piece, he had already had significant success in establishing himself as a writer. He'd left Guyana for England in 1948 with the manuscript of A Morning at the Office and secured a contract for its publication with the Hogarth Press in 1950. Although he met Leonard Woolf while working as a typist at the British Council, Mittelholzer was on his way to professional authorship, earning his living from his writing, a rare and precious thing at any time, but particularly in the 1950s for a Caribbean migrant novelist. And in 1952, when he's speaking out to writers and critics in Caversham, he's publishing The Weather in Middenschot, The Children of Kawama, and embarking on his almost decade-long publishing engagement with the prestigious Secker and Warburg. It's also in 1952 that he becomes the first West Indian writer to be awarded the Guggenheim Fellowship for Creative Writing. So we can be really clear that he's speaking from a place of security and confidence. He's on the stage, he's taking his bow. Ironically, I only found this lecture because I was searching for Edwina, and it was published in the same golden issue of Caversham from 1986 as a poem by Edwina Melville. And you can see on the slide that the search highlight is what I was looking for, what came up. I'll come forward to the 80s in a little while, but for now I just want to kind of give a note to researchers and critics how happy I am to work with electronic discoverability that flows utterly dispassionately against the grain of established canonicity, against the grain of historical value and visibility. It refuses all of those calibrations of significance of front and backstage writers that we become saturated in, even if we don't want to be. So seeing Mittelholzer and Melville in this shared space led me to think about, okay, what were they both doing at this time in 1952 or 1951, because we all know it takes a while for publications to come out. So when Mittelholzer is writing for Caversham from London, readying himself for a move to Montreal, Edwina, so fitting to all the qualities and determinations of the writer that he has identified, is in quite a different situation. She is now living in Leverhulme, having married Charles Melville, a widower with 5 children. In imagining her writing life at this time, a fragment of her diary from the 23rd of August 1951 is powerfully expressive. Feeling quite miserable, I live in the kitchen and haven't had a chance to cut my nails or write some poetry. And so many ideas enter my head, and for lack of chance, oh Lord, are gone. My hands are burned and chipped, and my face has lines I never had before. Yet I'm happy. 5 minutes ago, a snake fell from the roof on Chaz's foot, and he killed it with an arrow. We always keep too near the bed. There's no sense here of the introspective writer caught in a glass case. Writing is both an immediate and a distant reality, as Edwina bemoans not having the time to catch those poems. And yet through her diary, which she maintained in some form throughout her life, she's actually already beginning to write the Rupununi, narrating the compelling stories of her life there, where the seeming extraordinary is unremarkable, and any balance between making a home and a living and being a writer is exceptionally hard to strike. In October of 1951, Edwina gives birth to her first children, twins, Tondeley and Charlo, and her complicatedly demanding life as wife, worker, mother to her extended family, Rupununi dweller and writer intensifies. These pulls between domestic life and writing, paid work and writing, remain defining across her lifetime, but so does her animated approach to all of these and her genuinely astounding resourcefulness. Edwina represents the very opposite of the withering of the human spirit that Mittelholzer predicted for the writer isolated from a critical community. And it would seem that as Edwina negotiated the overlapping and usually overwhelming pressures of the imagined writing life on one hand and her life writing on the other, these projects come increasingly close together. And by the life writing, what I mean, and I'll show in a minute, is all the other acts of writing the Rupununi she was engaged in that weren't purely of professional authorship. Finding the time and the means to reconcile her passions for writing and for the Rupununi is a challenge she articulated very loudly throughout her life. But her writings do exactly this, with skill and grace and imaginative flair. The biggest contradiction that I want to bring to attention really in this lecture, particularly in this place, is the conundrum of how Edwina's writing is so explicitly about Guyana and the Rupununi. It is the Guyana and the Rupununi that make Edwina a writer, and yet how difficult, in fact how impossible it was for her to be seen as a writer in Guyana. Not only is her work often autobiographical and her literary sensibility finely tuned to the landscape and the skyscape and the soundscape of her region, and to the distinctive relationships between people and place, but she was really explicitly energized by wanting to deliver the beauty and the marvels of that region into writing. The question of who achieves visibility and recognition is clearly a really important one for us now thinking forward about the literary past of the future, and for us now looking back thinking, who have we forgotten? And there are different considerations for the different mid-century women writers I've been looking at. For some, they had another overriding professional obligation. For others, there was actually a recalcitrance about claiming authorship. They didn't want people to know they were a writer. And for some, they were preserving their husband's career and profile. None of those were the case for Edwina. She absolutely wanted to be known as a writer. Indeed, we'll see that, how determined she was to write and be known as a writer. So why has she remained unseen? Perhaps part of that was settling in the Rupununi that set her at a considerable distance from emerging Guyanese literary networks. Most notable of those were the British Guyana Writers Association and its little magazine, Kaik Overell, which was launched in December 45 and powered in many ways by the force of culture that was A.J. Seymour. Now, Seymour had a very different version of the writer to Mittelholzer, and the founding principle of Kaik was to be an instrument to help forge Guyanese people, to make them conscious of their intellectual and spiritual possibilities. And in the December 48 issue of Kaik, Seymour goes even further, talking about a sense of urgency around creative and cultural commitments of the writer, to put roots in the soil, speaking of the need to channel creativity into people-making rather than reputation-making. He says, we want the creative few somehow to plough their talents and forget their individual talents might do on their own. It's a case of community first, and perhaps in another century or two, we can afford as a people to grow our poets. Sorry for poets in the room. That's a bit bleak, but we're here. So I think that's really valuable. I think it helps us to understand that moment. We're obviously in a nationalist period for the greater good, and also a post-war period of the idea of the greater good. And again, it's important to me because this is very much Edwina's idea of the writer being expressed. So she wasn't an outlier to the idea of the Guyanese writer being promoted at this time. That's not why we don't know her. In fact, in all her correspondence, that remains really steadfast. All of her writings, journalistic, travelogue, literary, educational, administrative correspondence, all of them share this huge dedication to the Rupununi. And I really can't overemphasize how prolific and dedicated she was in her efforts to connect Guyanese life, Rupununi life, to writing. And that, the collage here is just really gives you a briefest, tiny little glimpse into the range of her work. And there's a beautiful short piece that she wrote called Talking Leaves, where she frames this vocation to write the Rupununi as an inheritance of hers. She says, this is Talking Leaves, and that's the Myakoni Creek. I'm Guyanese. I was born in Myakoni. At an early age, I followed my father into the forest, up the Myakoni Creek in a corral. One of my ancestors was an Arawat chief at Francois Mission in the Myakoni Creek. He was called Kaya? When I was old enough to leave our country school and go to Georgetown, Bishop's High School, I was sad and forlorn. When I told Kaya on our next trip up the Myakoni Creek that I hated school and books, he said to me, the white leaves you will read are talking leaves. I did not understand. He plucked a leaf from a tree nearby and said, look, today it is green, tomorrow it will be yellow, the next day it will be brown. They are only leaves. They are the only leaves I know how to read. They tell me of the sun and the rain. They tell me if a deer has passed this way and how long it has passed, if I'm in time to follow and find food for dinner or if it's too late. I watched him squeeze and crumple the leaf and drop it on the ground and step on it. Your leaves will not rot and fade away. They will tell all the secrets of the world, our joys and our sorrows. You can help do that if you learn to read when you grow up. You must remember Boisili Kaya, for I cannot make my leaves talk, but you can. I did not fully comprehend his meaning, but the time has come when I will try to make his leaves talk. As you can see on the top of the slide there, this was written especially for the first biennial Congress of the PNC in August 1975. But the handwritten note in blue ink on the corner of the top manuscript says, never used. So this story is one of so many pieces that Edwina wrote specifically for the Guyanese people that has not yet found its place. I haven't included a sample here for privacy reasons of the folders full of collective and individual acts of advocacy, where she writes with so much care and descriptive power on behalf of women who've been left with children, beaten by husbands, those who've been cheated or robbed or in need of hospital care. But all of that is part of her vital writing life as well. Indeed, for Edwina, being of and belonging to the Guyanese nation is founded on an expansive and inclusive recognition, a kind of people-making mission. And on an individual level, she expressed this in terms of her multiply mixed ancestry. She says, "My people are true Guyanese, having many bloods in their veins, Welsh, Scottish, Irish, Negro, and Arawak," obviously an anachronistic term now. But the other ancestry that Edwina proudly claimed was that of her maternal grandmother, Leila Parrott, a suffragette. And her feminist politics can be seen in the fact that she was the first woman in Guyana to have a tractor license, in her role founding the 1975 Hinterland Women's Association. And if you have a little look there at the newspaper, her clipping there, she names all of these women. She puts them on the record. Her involvement with the Women's Revolutionary Socialist Movement and her reading in of the Equal Rights Bill in the Guyanese Parliament. In all of these ways, that inheritance was important too. And also, as I'll come on to show you, how she presents her writing life. Certainly, her twinned emphasis on her commitment to Amerindian people and women was apparent in the tributes following her death on Guyana Republic Day in 1993. While I would hope that her fierce focus on women's experiences seems all the more reason for us to celebrate her today, her foregrounding of herself as a woman may not have chimed so favourably with the anticipated figure of the writer in her own time. It may have seemed insignificant when I read Mittelholzer's quotations that he assigns male pronouns to the writer, to the critic, to the publisher. But if I widen that context out a little bit and dive into the archives with it, I don't think it's quite such a coincidence. In 1960, the year that Wilson Harris left England to pursue his career, left for England to pursue his career as a writer, the year Palace of the Peacock was published by Faber and Faber, marking an important moment in Guyanese literary history. A.J. Seymour publishes a piece, From Raleigh to Carew, the Books of Guyana, in Kaik over L. Oh, sorry, I haven't got one on that. He answers his own question. What is the range of the volumes in the Guyana bookshelf? How shall we value our heritage? Where is it locked away? He turns to male administrators, political leaders, as well as all the writers we would expect to hear of, Carter, Carew, Harris. It's only at the very end of the piece, when he considers the lack of children's stories, that some women's names appear. West Indian Fairy Tales by Gertrude Shaw in 1914, Celeste Dolphin's Broadcast to Schools programme, and Joy Alsop's Teddy the Toucan, published by the Government Information Services in 1960. These are the only women mentioned, and there is no sense of any overlap between writers whose works are of literary value and those whose works are of educational value. There's also no mention here of Edwina, even though by 1960 she has broadcast 4 pieces from London on the BBC Caribbean Voices programme. Fishing in the Rupununi Savannahs, British Guyana in 1953, Memories of Atkinson's Field, 1954, The Voice, 1954, and Din the Fire Tiger, 1955. Given that Carew, Martin Carter, Wilson Harris, Edgar Mittelholzer, Dennis Williams, Gordon Wolford, and A.J. Seymour himself all had had work featured in that same programme, it seems a little unlikely that they didn't know of Edwina's work also being broadcast very much about Guyana at the same time. Edwina had in fact also published in Kaik in 1953, both an early poem of hers and the Wapashana Indians of the Rupununi Savannah. So I corresponded with Swansea, and then I met with him, and I asked him, who are the women writers? Who are the women that I should know about? I'm interested in them. And he gave Edwina special attention. He says, far away in the high savannas of the Rupununi in Guyana, there was a particular favourite of mine, a girl called Edwina Melville, who was the only writer to send material direct to London. I often wonder what happened to her. So Swansea's admiration and affection for Edwina was obviously not in question. So here we have this kind of amazing woman who I've outlined for you already how formidable she was. And he says to her, calls her a favourite of mine, a girl called Edwina Melville. So that really skews the frame, I think. It shrinks the possibility for him thinking of her as a serious writer in the same way that he did of Lamming and Walcott. And then that wistful remark, I wonder what happened to her. It's a kind of assumption that she would not have been able to survive as a writer. She would not have been able to continue as a writer. Her career would have been... Oh, we can stay there, that's fine. Let me have a look. Yeah, we can stay there. Although actually, I won't let it. So his wistful remark about this is, it suggests that he didn't anticipate that she could sustain a career. And digging a little deeper into the archive suggests that his sense of her ephemerality was at least on account of his sense of her gender. So piecing together Edwina's correspondence with Henry Swansea, which I haven't been able to do completely. Does that sound weird? I've been to the archives in Caversham. I've consulted the amazing Lorraine Nero in the West Indiana Special Collection in Trinidad. And I found some in her personal papers. But in her first letter to Swansea in October '53, when he's accepted fishing in the Rupununi, she asked him straight away, great, will you accept a longer piece? Could it be broadcast in 2 parts? And what if I send 2 or 3 stories of what she calls wildlife true? Although, along with this talking, this insistence that she be recognised as a professional writer, she always offers and shares intimate insights into her writing life. She's what my colleagues would call oversharing. So she says, Mr. Swansea, it may be, is it that one? No. Mr. Swansea, excuse me a minute while I tell you what's going on in the house. My husband just got back from a night's fishing and is fast asleep in the hammock. There's even a moment when Melville's sketching of that environment seems to carry an allegorical function. The discovery of fish teeming and swarming with a hum equivalent to an engine is followed by her explanation of the ruar fish. It's the male who makes the noise. The female just slithers silently along, tired with the burden of eggs she carries. Throughout, there's this strong sense of women's yearning to participate equally in the world beyond the home, to engage equally in the pleasures of the land, the thrill of adventure, that really chimes with the voice in her correspondence. In many ways, her correspondence and her writing are one body of work. So although in 1954, Swansea returns her poems, suggesting she needs to work on her technique, something Richard would approve of from his masterclass, he also tells her that she need not worry because she needs nothing more than what he calls her racy prose. And in June of that same year, this is the year he leaves the Caribbean Voices, Swansea writes in his diary, which has only very recently been published by People Tree. Gloria Vaz reads the sketch, The Voice, by Edwina Melville, describing the reception of one of her broadcast stories on the lonely ranch and Pranza on the remote Rupununi Plateau, true art if artless. I sent the script to London Calling. It is the most vivid thing I have ever seen on the General Overseas Service. So here we have the very person who's been credited by the likes of Camar Brathwaite, George Lamming, for his role in the curation, if not the creation, of Anglophone Caribbean literature, identifying Edwina's writing as the most vivid. He kept the photograph, this one here, of her with Tondi and Charlo on the water buffalo. He kept that in his diary. And in September of that year, her exquisite story, The Voice, was published on the front cover of the BBC magazine, London Calling. And I'm going to ask Tondeley now to come up and read The Voice for you so you can hear that story.
Hi everyone. It's a real joy to be here, and very emotional for me right now. So I brought a little turtle. My mom loved turtles and made them so that we as kids could play with them. And she would copy the number of spots and squares, so she would get all the detail in there. So all of us as kids have a turtle. And I'm trying to channel her right now, so. Okay, Alison, you gave me something here which I need a magnifying glass for, but this is, you can hear me at the back? Yeah. The Voice by Edwina Melville. Can you imagine a thatched roof that does not whisper? There is nothing more still than a windless moonlit night in the Rupnuni savannas. Nothing more nostalgic and full of strange, haunting charm all its own. The plaintive strum of a guitar accentuates the silence, and vaqueros looming in the shadowy night, their hands deftly weaving new cowhide lassos for the roundup, plait silently on the rope, sighing in swift, harsh jerks as they flick, switch, and pull taut. Mountains crouch away when they're quite close, and loom near when they're far away. A cow's horns glisten white, and a bull mooing in the distance, poignant, sad, a mournful challenge in the silent night. Wispy rags of cloud stretch across the moon's face, so much space up there. Clouds, stars, and a solitary moon. Air that is full of voices, limitless dome of heaven, so full of sound. Some men build slender steel pyramids to clutch the sounds out of the sky and transmit them for all the world to hear. Others simply press their hands together, and their fingers form a pyramid that points to the sky, not to clutch so much as to pray. Tonight, a voice will come out of that sky and spiral along a thin wire and come out through a little box the white man calls a radio. The batteries are low and need recharging, but the master is away from home, and the little mistress doesn't know how to start the charging plant and connect the web of wires. Dinner is finished, and McHugh, the dusky Indian girl, clears away the plates. She sees her mistress has barely touched her food, and immediately Coco, the old grandmother, has finished eating. The mistress jumps up and runs into the radio room with a torch. The knob snaps and a soft humming noise begins. Sitting down in the darkness, Nancy peered at the rosy dial and began to turn the rangefinder, praying that she had not turned on too late or too soon, because the batteries were low, and she had a hunch that they would not last forever, and she would lose the whole program. Tonight was the night they would read her story. She could hardly believe it, but the BBC in London had actually accepted her story, and tonight she would hear it. Sudden squeaks and bits of music, a funny whirring noise, and voices speaking a strange language. Oh, she prayed, let me find the station quickly. The night was so hot, not a breeze, not a friendly sound. Oh, the rangefinder, the needle moving slowly, oh so slowly. Trying to pick up the London, the BBC. Then a voice, the program already started and the reader already halfway through the story. Her story, her eyes shining in the glow from the radio's dial. Nancy suddenly leapt from her crouching position and shouted, Coco, McHugh, oh come, Coco, come quick. It's a story, my story, McHugh. Call the vaqueros, quick, tell them to come. And McHugh, like a shadow, darting outside and in a flash returning with the boys, all of them puzzled, ready to laugh, wanting to see, to hear, to know. Kanam, they whispered among themselves. What is it? Only the voice, clear and powerful, coming over, repeating now and then the names of people and places they knew. A few English words they could catch, and one of them, so excited, wanted to tell the others he understood what he'd heard. Translated one word, kapow, he said clearly, fish, and their faces lit up and they smiled. there in the darkness, leaning forward the better to hear. Nancy told them in breathless, excited sentence in English, sure they would understand. You hear? I write, people speak. From far, far country, named London. Queen lives there, the big white queen, look. And flashing on the torch, the beam covered the picture above the radio. A picture of a fair young woman in a beautiful long dress. The queen, she repeated. Suddenly, even as she spoke, the words the voice spoke on the radio sounded fainter. The voice was dying away, fainter and fainter, and suddenly it was gone. Even the throbbing hum of the radio had died down. Nancy stared at the dial as though in a trance. No, she cried. Oh, no. Frantic, she twirled the knob and brought it back to the same place, but only the silence met her there. She slapped the knob on the side of the radio with a sudden vicious movement. It's the batteries, she said in a cold, bitter voice. They run down. The vaqueros turned and went out first, laughing softly. McHugh hustled back into the kitchen to wash up her wares, and Coco returned to her spinning, her long gray hair falling about her shoulders, the cotton spinning out slowly and impatiently. Only Nancy, in a turmoil seeking the moonlight and the sudden breeze that had sprung up. Yes, there was a breeze. She lifted her face and felt the coolness of it, and the same moment she heard the thatch roof begin to whisper again.
Really, we should just have a reading. But perhaps it matters to know how that was not recognized. So in a letter to her sisters in July of that year, she shares her huge excitement at this publication. She says, have you by any chance seen my story reproduced in London Calling? I don't suppose the BBC magazine was a big read. She said, well, I'm so surprised. I don't know if they'll pay for it. And that matters because she wants to be paid as well as recognized. I think it's just a big honor when they use a person's stuff. Anyway, Mrs. Lindo, this is Gladys Lindo, who sorted the stories from Jamaica, wrote and congratulated me and said it's only the second time in the history of Caribbean Voices that a contributor's work has been used for the magazine. And she is so proud. So here's Lindo saying, well done, the other woman in the circuit who's also been silenced. Yes, and a letter from Mr. Swansea. Well, I have to treasure that letter to my heart. I feel as though it's just exactly what I would have written to someone like me making a little victory for the first time. So this is what he said. Dear Mrs. Melville, I hope you will be pleased by seeing what has become of your script. Don't imagine, I implore you, that it has set the Thames on fire and that you must come at once to London to follow it up. But it is a pleasant success, all the same. I hope others will come to you in the future. Yours sincerely, Henry Swansea. It was certainly an important gesture of support and recognition, though of a completely different order to the unofficial agency work that he took to connect someone like Walcott to publishers. And to me, Swansea's words echo something of a condescending tone. The assumption that Edwina is apart from other Caribbean writers who are making their name in London at this time. In fact, the next day in his diary says meeting Sam Selborne for lunch. While Edwina is at pains in her letters to show Swansea how serious she is about her writing, despite these really challenging domestic circumstances, he's drawing boundaries around her writing life, which, along with the lack of mention of money, feel gendered to me. And sure enough, it is his sense of her as a woman writer that becomes clearer when she asks for his advice on publishing venues. In a letter from the 8th of July, he suggests that she sends her work to some women's papers like Queen or Good Housekeeping, who he believes will be interested in your daily life as a woman in a remote place. Given that Swansea and Caribbean Voices is so emphatically and repeatedly linked to the success of Caribbean literary authorship, it feels both sad and shocking that the writer he identified as especially talented, the most vivid, remained almost invisible in literary histories. While Edwina was thrilled to receive his letter, I could quietly scream that he whispered those words into his diary. Edwina could not see the comparisons that I can make, and in her letter of the 9th of June, she tells Swansea that someone has gifted her the Writers and Artists Yearbook. She says, "It's opened up so much opportunity and I'm determined to try and get my stories published elsewhere." Happily, Edwina did manage to sustain her writing career after Swansea left the Caribbean Voices. She did not take the steps he imagined. I searched for her writings in those women's papers with no luck, but when an eBay search came up for one story published by Edwina Melville called The Waiting Land, I had another lead. The story arrived as a literary orphan, cut from its bindings by eBay merchants indifferent to literary historical value. But it was from the esteemed literary Blackwoods magazine in Edinburgh, a venue recognised for supporting serious literary talent from 1817. Fortunately, due to the colonial habit of archives, which is often unfortunate, but in this case fortunate, Blackwoods magazine has a beautifully archived and preserved collection at the National Library of Scotland. And thanks to the wonderful assistance of Kirsty and McHugh, the curator there, I was able to trace Edwina's subsequent authorship adventures in the 1950s and 60s and her correspondence with Captain Blackwood. So while Swansea's thinking, oh, I wonder what happened to her when I moved away, she's moved on. I discovered that just weeks after she sends her story, The Waiting Land, to Blackwood in July of 55, he writes back to her asking about the story, what prompted the story of this visit to the Rupununi, and telling her, which I know would have pleased her, that she was going to be paid. In her reply, Edwina shares a defining moment in her life with Captain Blackwood, telling him when she made a visit to her brother, Tom, who was working for the Rupununi Development Company based at Warriwow Outstation in 1949. She says, haven't got this. All my life, I've heard fabulous stories of the Rupununi, so when I had the opportunity to actually visit this place, I was overjoyed. I grew to love the place so much during that brief year that it was only natural that I should find my husband there. She adds in her vivacious, guileless manner, I hope one day to break into the literary world with a bestseller full of stories or a story about this country and its people, ensuring that he's aware of her literary ambitions. So while most of us are familiar with the stories of how sustaining the BBC writer fees were for struggling migrant writers like Selvom, Edwina's own story of paid work is a little more particular and loops back to this insistence on her presenting herself as both woman and writer. At the same time, I think, reimagining that idea of the woman writer. She confides in Captain Blackwood, I will soon be adding another member to our family tree. I must tell you how terribly useful the pocket money from the manuscript you accepted will come. We have no doctors up here, and Georgetown, the city and its hospitals, reached by plane. I was very worried with only my husband to help, but now I shall be able to go to town. Her son Edward is born less than a month later. There's so much, obviously, there that literary history just doesn't find easy to carry. Edwina sending her stories with gifted stamps all the way to Edinburgh while juggling family life in the Rupununi. All in the same year that Lamming published The Emigrants in London. Her life so different, so distant to his, and yet her Caribbean experience so luminously rendered in an unquestionably prestigious literary venue. In 1957, Captain Blackwood publishes Edwina's Wapishana Village, which meant that by 1960, here we are. That's that lovely letter. By 1960, when she's not included on Seymour's bookshelves, she's already a favourite of Henry Swansea's and placing her writing and being given career advice by the editor of the magazine that published George Eliot, Mary Shelley, as well as Coleridge and Conrad. And let's forget that by now she's also a mother of 4 with her son Don Fabian, born in July of 1960. Whereas the rejected scripts for the BBC Voices programme have not been preserved, sadly, the Scottish archives show that Edwina continued to send work to Blackwood and not to be discouraged when he doesn't accept it. Although a rather buttoned-up Scotsman who chooses not to comment on the personal circumstances she so generously shares with him, he always adds an encouraging note. And in January of '58, he suggests that she secures an agent for her writing and shares with her the address of A.M. Heath, like a very different, he calibrates her very differently to, good housekeeping. In 1964, so we've got a time lapse now, Edwina receives a piece of news that she tells Captain Blackwood has amazed, stunned her with joy. Her story, The Girl in Green, won second prize in the Blackwood magazine competition and would be published in the 1965 issue. And I'm going to ask Tondeley to read a short section from that again so you have a sense of it.
I hope I don't bore you with this one. Okay. The Girl in Green, and this is just excerpts from it. As a small boy, I had lived this life with my father, for both he and my grandfather had been boat captains, and the knowledge came easy to me, because I loved nothing better than to hear them tell of the tricks of the mighty waters of my country. When I grew older, I became a crew member and eventually a bowman, then captain, and I own 2 boats now, but no son to follow me yet. It was the shyness of women that caused me to write this tale, because I'm tired of the teasing and taunts of other men. I used to answer them saying, "Find me a woman like a good strong boat. If she can run all the falls, I'll take her to wife." And the boys never could find one to present, so I continued taking life easy when on shore, which was always a humbug for me, unless it was on a trip when we were camping at one or the other of the boat landings. Otherwise, I was in a boat going up or coming down some river that was weary to most men, but that sparkled and was the essence of all life to me. However, came the night when we were camping at Tumarang on the Mazruni River, and an old Indian woman there was chanting and telling the boys a lot of nonsense about how much gold they would find and where to look for it, and the signs they must look for to know a good woman. As I was passing them, toting my hammock bag, the woman turned and called out to me. She was part Amerindian and had some Negro blood. I knew her well. She was always up and down on one or other of the boats. She was known as Minnie. "Hi, Bash," she called now. "Come now, let me tell you the future, man. Let me tell you how the river changed its course and where them black rocks hiding." She was smart, all right, for the changes in the river always interested me, and I was surprised she had read that much of my character right. I stopped and looked back and noticed a lot of my crewmen around her. So I went back, because I did not want them to feel suspicious of me or my boat. These people are funny, and superstition plays a big part in their makeup. And although I had no intention of bothering with what Minnie had to say, I just wanted to show them that I held no resentment. Just to humor them, I said, "Okay, Minnie, tell me something good now." She cautioned me about the same old places where I always took extra care. Then, just as I was picking up my bag to go, I was feeling for all the loose coppers in my pocket. She held my sleeve and whispered in my ear, "And look out for the girl with the tree in her hair and a message in her mouth, for that one you will love." She released me with a small shove and burst into a wild shout of laughter. The boys, suspecting it was some lewd joke, roared with laughter too. And clapping me on the back, they yelled after me, "I'll go on with he not like woman at all, Minnie. Must be going to take you for wife now, Minnie gal. Then you can tell her where all the rocks are hiding." I laughed as I swung away from the bunch. I never thought I would have a need to remember Minnie and her prophecies of warnings, but on that trip we had 2 narrow escapes. Do you want to continue? Shall I continue? Okay. So, one was at a place where the black waters surged, frothing over the river's teeth without showing a single sign of rock. Somehow I decided to change my usual course. It was just by chance I remembered the words of old Captain Chance. Boy, he told me once, when water look red, don't trust he. He busted itself against some rock down there and he bleeding. So I took the chance on the other side of the little island of trees, nearer to the bank, which is not usually used. We passed through with a slight grazing noise. No sooner had we passed safely beyond the little island that we heard shouts. Coming down the river, full speed and apparently unnoticed by us, as I had been navigating across the river to get to the other side of the island and had scarcely looked ahead, we saw a boat, heavy laden, shooting those rapids. She had already passed the island and the channel we had forsaken. She had obviously struck a rock and swung broadside, the river slamming her for all it was worth. Every man of her crew had grabbed his paddle and was striving in vain to right the cumbersome boat. In a moment, the captain had lost control, the bowman had lost his footing, and the terrified men stopped paddling. They were swinging in a dizzy circle, and if they had hit another rock, it would have been all up with them. Somehow the captain shouted his orders above the roar of churning water, and the bowman regained his stance. Somehow that boat was righted, and we saw them pulling into the bank to take stock and calm their nerves before going on. By the time I too had pulled into the bank, they had turned, and getting out, I took a cutlass and chopped my way through the bushes to where those badly shaken men were. Gold Queen was the name of the boat. I hailed her captain, and he was wiping his brow. Lord, man, I had a narrow shave, and you know, a dream last night. But he got no further, for I cut him short. You dream? Man, you fellows always dreaming. Hang it all, you nearly lost the boat and everybody just now, I tell him. Man, don't you know, when water looking bloody, you got to look for another path? Eh, hey, one of the crew chirped up. Can't stop now. Okay. A man as black as night and now looking as white as chalk from the fright they just had. Me say, look, that water get wine color. That is water to drunk and drown, man. But he tell me to shut up, man. He don't want to hear. Man, moaned the captain, we is nearly drowned. All right, a miss is as good as a mile, I snap at him. Get yourself to rights and carry on. It's a mercy I took the other channel, or else you would have come banging into me like a ton of bricks. It was then they stared at me, and I told them how the sight of the red water had made me change course, and only in the nick of time. And then Alison moved me on. Shall I go on? Okay. So I had a lot of time to become acquainted with Marlowe, for it took us 20 days to reach Apateri, and I'm telling you, if you want to know the character and caliber of a man, just take a trip with him in the bush for at least a week. That's the best way to know someone. If they're cruel or kind, brash or gentle, uncouth or refined, tolerant or antagonistic, it will all come out. I could not have asked for a better companion on that trip. He was a book of knowledge to me. There was not a subject he could not talk about. I believe he could have steered that boat just as good as or better than me. He had the eyes of a hawk. In the densest tangle of trees overhanging the green, he would spy an iguana, green chicken, we call it, and his aim with a gun was true. In rain or shine, Marlowe never grumbled. It was all a part of life he just accepted. When he caught plenty of fish and when he caught no fish, he was still the same agreeable companion. And he talked of his wife, so I talked of my loneliness, how I came to be content with my river life, and why I asked for nothing more, and yet sometimes I wished I had a cozy kitchen to sling my hammock instead of a rowdy hotel or beneath a leaking tarpaulin. He told me of his children, twins first, a boy and a girl. We hit the jackpot, he had said. Not too much longer. All right. The day was The day they were to disembark, we had just come through some pouring rain, and about 5 minutes before we stopped at the Upakari landing, the rain had stopped, and the sun came out bright and warm as though it had enjoyed its bath, as though there had been no rain at all. The men were all out, and I was just waiting for some of the baggage to be moved so I could get out and stretch my long legs, when I heard them calling my name. I was tired, and I stooped my long body out of its cramp to walk and clamber my way over the piles of baggage in the boat, and my paddle hands grasped gunwales as my eyes caught a glimpse of the scene on the bank. Through the gleam of the leaves and the reflection of the sun on the water hitting upwards, I saw the girl. I could not believe my eyes. How, where, who? The question came clamoring. I suppose because of all people, it was so unexpected, and I was so completely unprepared. Through the long years of living in boats, I stumbled and could have fallen. Somehow I got out and went up to them, and they introduced me. It's his daughter, they were saying. Then they said, oh, no, it's his wife. His wife? Yeah, that would explain it. That would explain her presence and the strange light in her eyes and the reason why such a girl would appear in such a place as this. It was because of him he was her husband, but what was more, she loved him. So this was the life he had often spoken of. In a green shirt as green as the forest or greener, with long red hair, the gentle sweetness of her seemed to wrap us all. It was because we had brought him safe. From my height, I looked down and grasped her hand. I seemed not to be able to let go of her hand. Her face lifted to mine, and her eyes searched mine. What did she see? A tall, lanky man with gray-brown eyes and a rueful smile playing around his lips, his whole being in gloom, and his face shaded and in gloom too, because of his wide-brimmed hat. Such a tall fellow, and she had thought her husband was the tallest. This is Captain Fidcow, Marlowe was telling her. His eyes never left mine for an instant. Her eyes never left mine for an instant. Slowly, she withdrew the small, cool fingers from my hand, my rough, big hand. Without moving, she said, Thank you, Captain Fidcow, for bringing my husband home. I bowed, and I wished I could have kissed her hand. But I'm no gallant, and such a gesture for me would have been awkward and crude, because I just do not know how. Yet the thought in my eyes must have communicated itself to her, for her eyes flashed a wistful signal as though to say, No, I'm his. I'm happy to be his. Do not want me. I can never be yours. For an instant, perhaps, I imagined it, her eyebrows lifted as though she had wished she could be too. One to love him and one to love me. I myself must have worn a willful expression as I said, Little lady, for you, anything. I was surprised at myself. The words, half bantering, were out before I could repress them. And here I was, 45 years old, and only now learning to say a flirting word to a beautiful and desirable girl. She moved through the forest with her hand in her husband's, and their voice made no sense to me as I stared at the spot where she had stood, and staring back at the boat being unloaded. But my eyes were misted when I blinked. I saw again the vision of the girl in green. That night, the boat hands played some sweet and sad music on their beat-up guitars, and then the Tusha of the village borrowed an old gramophone from the teacher, and they sharpened the needles on a stone, and the record sometimes was coaxed along, twirled by hand until the spring caught, and the old unforgotten melodies of my father's day wheezed out. Red Sails in the Sunset, Cuban Love Song, and Isle of Capri. You never hear those songs today. Even I, who have no radio and seldom have an opportunity to go to the movies, know that. A few Indian girls came and were soon dancing with the boatmen, but they held little interest for me until she appeared. She was going to sit on a bench that Tushao's little son brought for her when Marlowe pulled her out to dance. I did not want to watch them. It was like a sacrilege, but, try as I would, I could not tear my eyes away from them. They seemed made for each other. Their bodies seemed to fit together. They belonged. When the music stopped, she went to the bench and as she sat, she looked directly across to me with the same puzzled expression of pain in her eyes. I cannot remember where I looked, but my heart was turning over. At last she came to me as I sat lonesome with some rum untouched and an old enamel cup in my hand. "I will dance with you now," she announced. I stood up, and somehow we were moving awkwardly over the uneven mud floor of the two-shower thatched roof house. There was something green in her hair, and the smell of the forest came to my nostrils. A rasping voice and tone on the Isle of Capri that I found her. I felt all choky and suddenly held her close and buried my head in her neck. She did not pull away too much. It was as though she did it gently. For the second time that day, I felt as though I must fall, but she steadied me. She said softly, "Captain Feetcow, are you married?" "I'm sorry," I stammered, my eyes straight and my face burning. I didn't mean to do that." "It's all right," she said. "It's quite dark. I'm sure no one saw." "I'm the one that's sorry. But," and here she held her head back and looked me straight in the eyes, "but perhaps we're given this little time together. You see, perhaps all your life you may have shunned women, and now you've met me, and I'm already booked. This must be to wake you up to life that is passing you by. Captain Feetcow, you must not regret meeting me. You must be glad. I am." Yeah.
I don't know if any of you would have spotted it, but I think there might be a little clever intertextual nod there from Charlie Marlowe, the protagonist of Heart of Darkness, which was first published in Blackwood's magazine. I'm not sure, but it seems possible to me, her husband being Charles Melville. So here then is a mid-century woman writer writing with talent and charm about exactly the kind of Caribbean world that's being celebrated in London. But it turns out that Captain Blackwood, who I've been cheering through all my time in the special collections, is not so perfect after all. So he says to her, "I noted that you do not want your name given to this story, and I agree with this. In fact, I think it's better that readers are not told that it's written by a lady. Better than a girl, maybe, marginally. I prefer that we use the initials EM rather than boat captain." So if I'd never found Blackwood's archives, I could never have linked those stories. I mean, it's so her voice, but not conclusively. There are no clues as to why Edwina wanted to publish under the name Boat Captain, but we don't need much imagination to think why Blackwood wants her not to reveal her gender. The story appears as he wishes, the girl in green EM, and she's paid £40. Not bad in 1964. So it's perhaps enough to reflect on her authorial achievements up to that point, to consider what it means for Edwina and for us as literary critics to know that her creative flair and aptitude has been recognised and affirmed within institutions that have made the literary careers we continue to read. At the same time, to have been kept at bay, ultimately to have her talents whispered into diaries, to have her name concealed. And to think that her accounts of Rupununi life have been lauded in those same London and Edinburgh, but unable to find a place here in Georgetown. The next decade creates a huge chasm in Edwina's life, and it's certainly one that she sees as the most important limitation on her possibility for achieving authorship and recognition. The Rupununi Rebellion of January the 2nd, 1969 finds Edwina and her immediate family embroiled in a national incident. In an extract from a 17-page unpublished manuscript entitled The Ridiculous Rebellion, Edwina gives her account in the third person of encountering the violence of the fighting, scrambling to gather her children, their medicines, as many provisions as possible, across the Takatu River at night to Evaristo, and the subsequent confusion and challenge as her husband is questioned by the authorities and released. But regardless of that, the hardships that they suffered, including everything that they left behind here in Guyana, the sawmill, the cattle, the shop, and for Edwina, the metal trunk where she had so carefully preserved all her literary papers, her correspondence, her manuscripts, her draft. The trunk was looted and the papers just scattered and lost. Until their permission to return was granted in November 1973, Edwina feels effectively in exile from her correspondence. She is making every effort to clear her name and that of her husband. She tells a family friend in 74, "I never once gave up hope of being allowed to return and never 1 week desisted in my efforts to find out how I might make myself and my family come back to Guyana. Once you've lived in the Rupununi and call it your home, you could never be happy to live anywhere else." After her return, she makes monumental efforts to relaunch her writing career with enormous humility, as well as that old passion. And I'm just going to give you very quickly a sample of some of the correspondence from 1974, just to give you a sense of the intensity of those efforts. So she writes to Frank Campbell, the editor at The Nation, and she's asking if she can publish articles as a journalist, but also she tells everyone, "I've got these stories as well, could we publish those?" And he follows up, and she says to him, "Please put the Rupununi on the map. Everyone here is grousing that we're left out." In September 26, she writes to Sir Lionel Alfred Lucko. Following his piece in the Chronicle called "Where Are Our Writers?" she said, "You may remember, I used to do some writing long ago, and I still write. I have to write or I go mad. I have lots of poems and stories, some true, some legend, about the flora and fauna of Guyana. I would like very much to devote all my time to writing, but how to get them published? Where? Whom do I apply to?" And then she adds this lovely characteristic. "This is just a hurried letter as I dive around between jobs looking after grandchildren, chickens, and pining, dying to get down to some good writing. Please see if you can help. Just direct me where to go. I don't want to send my stuff overseas. It's Guyanese for Guyana." September the 27th, she writes to the editor of The Graphic, "I have quite a few poems and legends about our local fauna and would very much like to compile the best pieces and put them into a book, something like Savannah Sagas. Would you be interested in publishing such a collection?" On October the 22nd, she writes to Shirley Field Ridley, the Minister of Education, reminding her that Sir Lionel's piece is said to contact her. She also explains that she'd replied to an advert that actually said local writers wanted, and she'd never heard anything. And then a team had come and told her they'd received a great quantity of letters with sample stories, and my story had been adjudged to be the best. She says, "I was so pleased, we had a long talk. I wanted to write the turtle story, in local vernacular Creolese. It makes it far more humorous and interesting to read, to me anyway," she says. She then comments that her sister is looking for a publisher for her in the US. She says, "I don't want that. I want to publish locally." She says, "Is there really no possibility yet of Guyanese getting a fair deal of what they can produce? Is there no publishing house here where I could send my stories for vetting?" There is by now an exasperation at not finding a foothold in the Guyana literary scene. And given how many undated manuscripts were left among her papers, poems, short fictions, plays, it was clear that her habit and her love of writing was never diminished, even if her channels for dissemination dried up. On the 8th of July 1976, Edith Peters, the coordinator of the music education programme, writes to Edwina to apologise for not attending an event in the Rupununi. It seems that she too had been asked the same questions about where to publish. She says, "I cannot say where to get your works published, except to refer you to the National History and Arts Council. But things are moving so fast in Guyana today that I'm sure there is hope that in the not distant future, talent and ability such as yours would be recognised and utilised for the mutual benefit of yourself and our country." I don't think, from all I've read of hers, that patience was one of Edwina's many virtues. And in 1980, she writes to A.J. Seymour to try and make that recognition come a little faster. She says someone, not one actually, says I should put my plays in a little booklet and share them with other Guyanese who are racking their brains for plays with the local background. So I'm writing to ask you if you could officially write to ask me to do that, and I would if you paid. After 30 years of determined application, Mittelholzer's sense of withering from isolation is finally becoming a reality for Edwina. She continues, I see my poem, Rorama, that I sent to the 1975 Guy Festa was never found. It was carefully lost, and so never got a chance of being heard or seen. I was also surprised you were able to squeeze in 2 of my old ancient poems, written when I was 16 years old, and one has a mistake, musky instead of husky. Wow, hard, love us. Substantially, I think Edwina's sense of herself being lost to Guyanese literary history was right. Although she appears from time to time, it's only as an echo. The work published in the 1971 collection, My Lovely Native Land, an anthology of Guyana, was her 1953 work. The 2 teenage poems that were published in Caversham in volumes 17 and 19 reappeared in the 1980 Treasury of Guyanese Poetry, hence that letter. And then the 1953 one is republished again in 1986, despite the letter. And her biography for the 1986, sorry, that's some of her things. Her biography for the 1986 publication reads, Edwina Melville, Guyanese journalist. She has published unusual love poems from the Rupununi. Presumably another echo of the 50s that erases all she had achieved in those intervening 30 years, including, by now, having been called to the National Assembly in March 1993 and sworn in as a Member of Parliament for Region 9 in April of that year. I do not know, I genuinely do not know, whether Edwina could not find her place as a Guyanese writer because the gaze was set on the capital, or on those who had migrated, or on men, or whether, as she suspected, people were, to quote her, thinking rebel family and had condemned me without even knowing the truth or tragedy of our experience at that lamentable time. Or perhaps, most pessimistically, there was barely a place for the Guyanese writer. Local writing was not being regarded as proper literature. A.J. Seymour himself has said he'd been made to feel that as a young man. Perhaps most optimistically, her reputation for acts of political representation had eclipsed those of literary. When Edwina died on 23rd of February, Mashramani Day, 1993, her obituary in the Starbuck News did mention both acts of representation, although the political was clearly dominant. Recognised for over 40 years as a leading member of the community, she adopted upon her marriage to Charles Melville in December 1950. Mrs. Melville was known for humanitarian work throughout Region 9, and for her absorption in the culture and environment in which she lived. Her political activities on behalf of the People's National Congress were people-orientated. Her writings were published over the years in Blackwood's magazine, in the Old Chronicle newspaper, in poems, stories and reports. Another one here. This is her being sworn in. This is her, the London Calling scrap of correspondence. And then in the top corner there, you can see one of the many envelopes that we found going through the papers where she writes, Tondi, keep this letter safe. I answered it in minute detail and made a copy of my reply as parts of it will be needed for our book. So another part of the obituary says, Edwina Melville loved Guyana with all her heart, and as a self-appointed ambassador at large, she fearlessly and passionately defended her beloved country. Only Patamba Persaud's piece, Edwina Melville, 1926 to 1993, published in 2008 in the Sunday Chronicle, offers a fuller acknowledgement of her contribution as a writer, emphasising her works that bring Wapishana life to literature. So then, to return to Mittelholzer's brutal but pressing question, what is the use of a literary critic? What is the use of my critical endeavour at the patchwork recovery of Edwina Melville that's navigated a path through Caversham, St Augustine, Edinburgh, to family papers in Ann Arbor, and now back to Georgetown? What would it take and what would it mean to bring Edwina Melville, the writer, back home? In one sense, it fulfills Seymour's hope in establishing the Mittelholzer lectures, that these might, he said, help make young intellectuals aware of their own heritage and assist a regular stimulus towards informed discussion of the nature of the developments of arts in Caribbean society. But bringing Edwina's works back into view, as Tondeley and I are planning back into publication, will also enable new connections in literary history. It will certainly dismiss the idea, the narrow idea of the mid-century Caribbean writer as a migrant male in the metropolis, and revise the chronology of Guyanese bookshelf. Like all the male writers who put Guyana on the literary map, Edwina imagines its environmental specificity. Her attention to Rupununi life considerably also enriches the literary focus on indigeneity. It would restore her as a literary foremother, not just for Pauline Melville, whose writing beautifully renders some of the same shared landscapes and stories, but for Mahadai Das, Raj Kumari Singh, Beryl Gilroy, Janice Shineborn, Maggie Harris, Unya Kempedy, Mei Ling Jin, Namala Sucharan, and others. And there is no doubt that Edwina Melville would be named an eco-warrior in our contemporary language. Her sensibility about living in a non-extractive way, paying keen attention to local knowledges and advocating for their preservation and ongoing integrity infuses all of her work. And also there's a whole strand of journalistic writing in that vein too. Her short stories focused on the domestic, the local, the intricately human, offer important glimpses into a different Caribbean literary aesthetic and ethic that was quietly in the making alongside those nationalist and masculinist novels that we now identify with that period. In their careful renderings of the involved lives of community, they restore a fitting back history to the works of accomplished contemporary women writers like Olive Senior and Lorna Goodison. Another good of this critical mode of recovery is, I hope, to confront the significance and the size of the loss with which we work, and to recognise that Caribbean literary history, like all history, risks being an invention of the empowered. We need to be responsible to that recognition. We need to go back as much as forward, and we need to look insistently and with huge energy and stamina against the grain, because it takes a lot to go against the grain. So I hope that what I've been able to share today, which is just really a kind of tip of the iceberg in terms of why I believe Edwina Melville and her writings are truly exceptional, and what I think it would mean the most to her and to those of us interested in literature, for her to be acknowledged here, and for her writings to be taken out, in Mittelholzer's words, from backstage obscurity, so that she could be here and take a bow. Thank you.